We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Justice Breyer is stepping down from the Supreme Court, and President Biden is set to replace him with a black female come hell or high water. But is it going to be an easy win for the president? And perhaps more importantly, will it get him the respect that he thinks he deserves? We're talking liberty with constitutional attorney, legal affairs editor, and host of the always excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, to help us figure out the maths on this. Welcome back, Scott.
Cheers, Mark, and thank you. Always a pleasure.
So, Scott, you wrote recently that Joe Biden traded his support for a black female nominee for presidential primary support from House Majority Whip James Clyburn. Now, it seems that Joe Biden made good on his pledge to Clyburn, but are the American people happy about it?
Well, no, they're not. Only, I think, 27% at a maximum level of Americans polled support this kind of decision-making, affirmative action decision-making for the Supreme Court, and those were people of color. So even in the communities where you think it would be the most popular type of decision-making, just because of what they're sold on a daily basis from the legacy media, they're not for it. And when polled American-wide, I think it was only 23% of Americans support it. So the rest of the people stand in opposition to this kind of decision-making. And it's important to remember when Joe Biden wraps himself in that cape of, racial heroism and civil rights heroism, that this was just a pay-for-play deal that he used to secure his own nomination. It had nothing to do with any good intention, just Joe Biden's desire to have power.
Yeah, it was James Clyburn of South Carolina. It was his support that really set off the numbers for Joe Biden's primary run, I believe, was it?
Joe Biden had never won a presidential primary in his 3 attempts at becoming president of the United States until 3 days after that endorsement came in. And the week before the endorsement, he was polling at like 23 percentile, I think, in some polls in the state. And he won with a plurality of like 47 some percent. At the time, it's, now obviously he's the president and he'll be the nominee if he wants it, presumably. But back then it was a real iffy proposition as to whether or not Joe Biden would win the nomination. And Clyburn's endorsement basically sealed the deal for him.
Kingmaker Clyburn, indeed. So who are the front runners for this Supreme Court nomination? And to date, do we know how, let's say, acceptable they'll be to the Senate as a whole?
Mark, for me, I think Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, is my guess for who he's going to pick. There are a number of other names that have been bandied about, right down to, and I do say down to, meaning it would be the bottom of the barrel choice, which is that of Kamala Harris. And I think it's just preposterous to think that she'll be nominated, but a lot of Democrat Party activists are pushing that name. I don't think there's a chance in hell that that's going to fly, though, because of the second part of your question, in part, which is that she won't be well received in the Senate. It's, of course, the body that she served in, by Democrat senators, by the way. I'm not even just referring to Republicans. And some of the other names, too, that we see tossed around will also likely not face a welcome reception in the Senate, which is one of the reasons why Judge Jackson, I think, will be the nominee. She's already been vetted for what is, kind of commonly referred to as the second highest court in the land, which is that D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So she passed muster for that vote, and she hasn't done anything while on that court to suggest that she's unfit for the highest levels of judicial service.
Okay, I think it's important to make that this nominee, if it's Ms. Ketanji Brown Jackson or anybody else, will need to be acceptable both to Democrats and Republicans, because just last week we saw Democrat Senator Lujan out of New Mexico. He had a stroke, essentially counting him out of the Senate for a little while. Now, with a 50-50 split, obviously Kamala Harris being the one that picks it over the top, there are a number of factors that could go wrong if Biden relies only on Democrat votes. Isn't that right?
I think the more important point to address is what you just said about Kamala Harris putting a vote over the top. None other than Lawrence Tribe who is a legal scholar, who's a former professor of law at Harvard, and has been used by the Biden administration as kind of their kind of
go-to constitutional scholar.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, with like the big gravitas, he has all this sort of weight in the legal community. And he said before the Biden administration took office that a vice president could not vote to break a tie in a Supreme Court nomination. And the reason why is that while the vice president can vote for regular legislation to break a tie, in the advice and consent role, which is what the Senate is performing in that nomination of the justice, the confirmation of the justice, they have no role. The vice president does not. And so he was recently asked again whether he still holds this, whether he's a hypocrite, basically, I think is sort of the question. And he's not in this area in any case. And he said that it would be unconstitutional for Kamala Harris to cast a vote in this role. So your point is even more important, or the question is even more important. I don't think you're going to see any Democrat defections from that nominee, for instance. If you go to some of the more radical names that have been tossed around, some of the law professors, it's also a little bit of wishful thinking, like somebody who has a friend who's a law professor who works in the White House, they might leak a name. It's difficult to determine who really is at the top of that list. But because of her position as a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, who was already recently vetted. That's the other thing you have to remember about the confirmation process. If you want a speedy confirmation, the best possible thing to do is nominate somebody who has had a recent nomination to the federal courts, because all of their background, their writings and all have already been submitted to these bodies, and they have them for reference and have already vetted them.
So we can assume that because of her prior vetting, which is so recent that unless she's done something insane within the last couple of weeks, it still holds good. But politically, do we think that Republicans are likely to back the nominee, or will they vote against her on principle?
Well, historically, Republicans they give much greater support to the nominees of Democrat executives than the reverse. Democrat legislators often withhold their support from Republican choices, seemingly for political reasons. The idea that, for instance, not a single Democrat senator thought that Amy Coney Barrett was a suitable justice, a suitable person to be a justice on the Supreme Court, I think is a bit ridiculous. I think that they did it just for political means. And if you look at the votes historically of who votes for whose picks more, Republicans have a much more likelihood of crossing the aisle. And the idea that some of the more liberal senators, like a Susan Collins, for instance, would vote no on Judge Brown, I don't see that happening. So I think it'll be an easy ride for somebody like that if she's nominated.
Now, Ilya Shapiro, who's a Georgetown professor, he's been put on leave for making tweets about Joe Biden's decision to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. What's the story here?
Well, are you a professor if you're suspended before your first day at work? It's an interesting question. I think they're still paying him, so I suppose he is. He tweeted about the negative aspect of picking a justice and having their first qualification be the color of their skin, and the second qualification being their private parts. That's the idea that he bucked against. And he said that the justice would always have an asterisk next to her name, and basically that they were a lesser candidate. And he phrased it kind of a little inartfully, but that was the crux of his argument. And boy, the left really came for him. And it's one of these deals where if you could take a statement one of two ways, and one way is a academic objection to affirmative action and race and sex-based choices, and the other way is that somebody is just a racist. There's kind of a willful misunderstanding, if you will, and that's the position of the Georgetown Law School, like Black Lives Matter Club. I forget what they actually call it, but that's essentially what it is. And they've made hay over it. And he is a libertarian, and that's one of the reasons why they're gunning for him, because anybody who's not sort of the pro-progressive or leftist views gets, naturally attacked when the opportunity arises, and the opportunity has arisen. Of course, the correct response for anybody who values academic integrity and free speech in any remote way would be to just tell those Twitter mob brush off and go pound sand. But that's not the case at Georgetown Law, where they have embraced the consequences of annoying people on Twitter.
Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that almost does us for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank you, our faithful listeners, for being here, and our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Dave Patterson, Tim Donner, and Scott DiCosenza, for taking the time to join us. And my parting shot for this week concerns language. When President Biden speaks, his words are clarified by the White House press secretary, who passes on his actual meaning to the Fourth Estate, who then, in turn, spin and massage his words into something these so-called journalists feel is palatable to the masses and in the finer interests of the government they so ardently support. I'm reminded of the words of President William Taft, who once said, "Don't write so that you can be understood. Write so that you can't be misunderstood." Now, communication is easy. Speak honestly. Speak true without trying to make yourself appear an elite in your knowledge, and the world will understand your meaning perfectly. It's when we attempt to lie or obfuscate or cover up that the necessity of convoluted speech comes forward. Is it too much to ask that those who claim to lead us treat us with at least some honesty and respect? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I can
others.
do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.